cooperation with each other. And not like Wall Street, who was at this time not doing very well.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So things are moving and changing, and if we don't move and change with it, we will basically not exist. We will, kill ourselves off. I mean, which we are doing with nature. So, and we know, as we now know, where I stand on evolution. No, but that's just kind of like philosophically, if you want to create a different type of a society, you have to look at the world in a different way, and not in the way that we've been looking at it, as during the Industrial Revolution. And look at education itself. We've been doing the same thing for the last 50 years. We've been teaching young people in buildings that are similar to jails and prisons to move towards an industrial, factory worker. We don't have those anymore. Manufacturing doesn't exist anymore. Kids used to be able to go to vocations or college, but the types of vocations need a higher education now because it's all technology. So education isn't moving the way that society is moving, and we're really kind of at a loss. So we're kind of running around with our chickens with our heads cut off, trying to find solutions, but it's more reactive than proactive, and we had an opportunity a long time ago to be more proactive. But of course, with taxes being cut from education and from health and human services, we are now dealing with the consequences of what we thought was a good idea 20 years ago, that we need to just take care of ourselves individually, when really, when it comes down to it, we need to take care of each other as a whole and support each other.
And that's not an emphasis of education either. I mean,
No.
Not at all. That's the emphasis of education is skill and drill, pass the test, and then you're knowledgeable. If you can pass this test, then you're smart enough to move on, but, we're lacking all of these other skills.
Colleges, universities are actually contacting high schools and telling them that the students that they send to college are ill-prepared.
I mean, there's never been such a high rate of need for remediation in college because
I noticed it when
prepared.
I was a non-traditional student in college. I went a little bit later, and I noticed the difference between students right out of high school and myself, because it's much easier for me to be given an assignment and say, okay, well, I'll ask a couple of questions, clarifying questions, and then go forward with that. A lot of the students need hand-holding still, to be like, okay, well, what is the process that I need to do to be able to get an A? And really, it's not about that when it comes down to life. And what I do for my job, I think, to be honest, if I was educated in this system now, I don't think I would be as successful as I am in my job.
Just because your job is sort of vague and doesn't have very strict
my
parameters,
job is,
and it's interpretive.
Basically, there's new things that come at me every day, new requests. People are asking me to do something different every day, so I have to cater my lessons depending on the needs of the group. If somebody says, well, we need an anti-bullying program for parents or for this grade, or we need something to talk about religion or race or gender differences or LGBTQ. Those are those are all very different but similar, but how I would deliver it depends on the group too, and what I want them to glean from that lesson. It takes a lot of thinking on my part and forethought, and for the most part, a sense of if I fail, it's okay, because I learn from it, and I don't think a lot of students get that nowadays. And that failure actually is positive feedback, and that's why a lot of kids who are all very academic centered and they get stressed out, they're all on anti-anxiety medication because they're studying for an exam, and they freak out and can't do it. Really, when you go forward into a job situation and you have a deadline and you need to turn in a report, you can't say, oh my God, I have to take my anti-anxiety medication, I can't do this. You need to just get it out. Or you lose your job. You know, you're not producing, and that's what what it is. It's not. We need people to be able to be leaders. We need them to be effective. We need them to be able to think on their own and produce. But that's not what is. When it comes down to funding, we want numbers.
Yep.
We want to know how many kids are passing, and if they're.
It's all about data-driven decision making. That's the
But
buzzword.
luckily, Minnesota has gotten a waiver from the No Child Left Behind fiasco.
That does not mean, however, that we won't still be
there
collecting
will still
data
be-
in
there
some
will
shape
be
or form.
There will be performance tests and exams, because it's really hard. How can you know if you're doing a good job, right? As a teacher, as an administrator, if you don't at least test the kids and see if they're learning. But then also, it doesn't mean, if you're taking, I think, if you're doing these tests and exams and you're getting this data, and the data, sometimes people create exams to get the data that they want, to continue getting the funding they need.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of using the data and changing the way they teach to get better results.
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay if you get bad data, because then you know that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
But if you ever get bad data, especially as a district, you're not going to get the funding. So that's just something to think about.
Any more questions you'd like to ask?
As far, so when immigrants move to Rochester, I don't know if diversity council has any part of this, but when immigrants move to Rochester, especially if they don't speak English,
Mm-hmm.
there's this whole, needing an apartment or a house, needing a job. Does the diversity council take any part in sort of bringing those immigrants into a world they really don't know?
We don't really do, what is it called? What is it called? Services where you actually work with the people. Food and clothing and stuff like that. I forget what it's called. The IMAA does that. We partner with the IMAA sometimes, but mostly there are other services that actually do direct services that supply housing, that supply education. And there's tons of resources for the immigrant population. That's one of the things that Minnesota does really well. Catholic Services helps with that. And there's, I think sometimes the United Way has some resources that do that. Off the top of my head. But we do offer information and resources for organizations that may be doing that work, so they can partner with other organizations. The thing about as a nonprofit and what we do, the type of work we do, is really underfunded. It is highly needed, but underfunded, which is, it becomes difficult because if immigrant populations that come in aren't getting the education, aren't getting the resources, it becomes a burden on our community, right? So instead of, hating on people who may be different from us, who might not speak English, I think what would be helpful and beneficial for us as a community is to help them find the best resources for them to be able to acclimate into our society. And also just us being welcoming to people. I think we make fun of people who don't speak English. But if you think of yourself, if you go to a country, most Americans, only 30% of Americans have passports. And if you think about that, not a lot of people know what it's like to be in another country. And if they do go somewhere, it's English speaking, like Canada or like England or Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I've traveled to different countries, and I'm not from here, I'm from the Philippines. And most countries are very, very accommodating and welcoming to stupid Americans who don't speak their language. And I wish we were just as welcoming and accommodating as they are. The reason why there is so much strife, I think, between Sudanese or Somali or Latin American cultures who are immigrant populations is because of the lack of communication and understanding. Just because they don't speak our language doesn't mean that they're not intelligent. I know a lot of people who are doctors and engineers, lawyers, and the reason they're not successful or doing well here is because of the lack of English speaking. And so if you think about somebody who might come from like Sudan who, because of the Civil War, who used to be a teacher, comes to America and has to drive a taxi cab. I mean, how that feels to that person. If you lived here in America and you were 40 years old, but something happened and you had to go to another country, you have to think psychologically and emotionally and mentally how that wears on a person, especially if you've come from, a conflict. So I think we need to be a little more compassionate towards people who are from other countries, especially if you think about the growing Hispanic community that's coming over because of lack of opportunity or jobs. It's not an easy trip. They don't just get on a plane and come over. They have to cross a desert. They have to fear police. The idea of providing services to people who might not be American citizens, for some people, may be like, oh, well, we shouldn't have to pay for that. We shouldn't have to educate immigrant students, or we shouldn't have to put money out to give immigrant families homes. But if you put yourself in their shoes, and if you were in their situation, the only difference between you and I and them is that we were born in America.
Right.
I also have a question sort of related to one that Leah asked earlier. In response to the abuse that recently the lesbian, bisexual, gay community has taken in high schools, is the Diversity Council leaving the focus? Well, not leaving, but sort of changing the focus from sort of race and religion to sort of LGBT acceptance, and on that note, have you guys received any resistance from teachers that may not agree on that subject?
We haven't really changed our curriculum too dramatically about specifically talking about LGBTQ students or people. I did do a continuing education class for teachers and administrators about the issues that LGBTQ students might be facing. But mostly, we mostly did race in the beginning, but as we moved and developed, immigrant populations and religion and LGBTQ and people with disabilities, it's mostly now we're kind of focusing on just diversity and people who need to be different and understanding discrimination. And so we try to cover all the classes that are protected by the Human Rights Act and try to do that in a comprehensive way. And when we talk about anti-bias education, we talk about everything. We talk about that you should treat everyone the same if they are black or white or gay or straight. And there's sometimes we want to do education about the LGBTQ population because I think there's a lack of understanding of what that is or what that means. And in no way do we, if there is pushback from teachers who may have faith-based resistance to that, it's not about faith. It's about freedom to be safe for all students, and and the type of harassment and homophobia